Hi, it's Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. The Trump administration is going after Harvard and other elite schools over their acceptance of federal taxpayer money and the conduct they're engaging in. And we say that's a good thing. We're going to unpack that today. I'm going to do it with 𝐃𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐥, the co-host of this program. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent. I might be better, both from a professional and personal standpoint, if I'd gotten into one of these elite Ivy League institutions. But as somebody who graduated from, a state university here in Florida, I'm trying my best, Peter.
Yeah, well, we don't know how you would have turned out if you'd gone to Harvard. You could have been even more snobby and elitist than you already are, saying that jokingly, of course. But so let's talk a little bit first about what the Trump administration is doing here, why they're doing it, and then let's talk about why this reform is overdue. Not just, I would argue, for the reasons the Trump administration has stated, but because of the waste and corruption and fraud that a lot of the universities have engaged in when it comes to this money. So what is the Trump administration looking for? What are their demands of the universities in order to continue to receive federal grant dollars?
Yeah, the Trump administration wrote Harvard, I wouldn't call it a strongly worded letter, but it was an official letter, and they asked for a few different things. They said, listen, we want you guys to move to merit-based admissions.
Right.
Okay, we give you some money, and these are the things we're asking for.
Right.
We want merit-based admissions, viewpoint diversity in admissions and hiring. So one thing that the Florida legislature has done is they do a survey of all the faculty and student body to try to get a sense of, hey, how diverse is the intellectual atmosphere? As we noted in a previous podcast, Harvard ranks dead last in terms of perception of intellectual freedom.
Yeah.
So they're trying to get viewpoint diversity. They want to reform programs with egregious records of antisemitism. And they also want to eliminate DEI. So those are the four main categories. The Trump administration said, hey, listen, we'd like you to do this. Harvard said respectfully, no, sir.
In that kind of tone.
In that kind of tone.
Right.
And then so the Trump administration said, okay, well, then we're going to take at least $2.2 billion away from you.
Yeah. So let's talk about all four of these briefly, right? And I think this is a great approach and a great effort that the Trump administration is taking on, because what happens at these private universities affects all of us, and they're private university in name, but they are all addicted to federal taxpayer dollars. And we're going to talk about some of those astonishing numbers later on. But let's talk about the first one, merit-based admissions. Now, you ran across a story that was truly shocking. Harvard University has instituted remedial math classes for incoming freshmen. This is an elite school. They have 54,000 applications that come in every year. And of that, they admit, 1,400, 1,500 students. Why do they need remedial math, and is it connected in some way to the lack of merit-based admissions at Harvard? I think it is.
I would say it's a tough argument for Harvard to take, even though they have a great law school and they're good at this. But it's a tough argument to make that you're only admitting 1,647 students out of 54,000 applications.
Right. Very elite, very selective.
And yet you need remedial math classes, which they introduced in September last year. They said, quote, students don't have the skills that we had intended downstream in the curriculum. We want to make sure that students are on path to success starting from their first day. This remedial math class is going to meet 5 days a week as opposed to just 2.
Right.
And so, but I was like, well, what is happening? What trends do we know about admissions in Harvard? And so I went and I looked at some remedial math, and I looked at their incoming statistics. So they said of all the people they just admitted for this current class, 14% identified as African American or Black, 37% identified as Asian American. So almost 3 times as much Asians versus Blacks, 16% identified as Hispanic or Latino, 1% Pacific Islander, 16% international. You know what and then they say 8% choose not to say their race.
Right.
What's interesting is they don't reveal what percentage of, let's call them Caucasians, they admit. But if you do a little bit of math, you add up 14, 37, 16, 1 and 16, you are left to conclude that even if everybody else admitted was Caucasian, that ends up being 16%.
Yeah.
And so when you consider that white people generally represent about 58% of the country's population, and yet 16% on par with African Americans and Hispanics and far less than the Asians. I know Harvard's been accused of having some anti-Semite problems.
Yeah.
They also might have an anti-He-white problem.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and this is the point, right? If you have merit-based admissions, those numbers in a way shouldn't matter, right? You're not going to try to reach some kind of racial balance, or you're not going to try to favor certain racial groups. Harvard has a history of this, of course. Back in the day, 100 years ago, big problem of them not wanting Jews attending Harvard University. The WASPs weren't quite excited about that. Today, it seems to be an emphasis on trying to get what they call underrepresented minority groups. That would be blacks, for example, more of them on campus, which is, again, is great. But the problem is, are you doing that? By doing that, are you destroying the standards? And the fact that you now need remedial math, and I looked at this article that you found, we're not talking about trigonometry here. We're talking about basic algebra, basic geometry that Harvard freshmen are having to take because they're not equipped to do it. And part of the reasons they don't have merit-based admissions is not only these racial policies, but you pointed out, beginning with COVID, they started not requiring the SAT test. So they're going based on what? Teacher recommendations, extracurricular, what their transcript looks like, and probably their racial composition.
Yeah, it's definitely not based on how they did on the SAT or ACT. They made testing optional starting in 2020. A lot of universities did that, or certainly many did.
Yeah.
But then I think a lot of other institutions have reinstituted those tests because whatever you think about them, they are an objective metric by which a certain skill set can be measured. And apparently Harvard has done a poor job of measuring mathematical aptitude. Now, look, depending upon what you want to study, not everybody needs to be great at math, but to the extent that algebra and geometry represent your ability to kind of hold a set of rules and draw logical conclusions based on those, I think it's telling that capacity has gone down significantly at one of America's allegedly elite institutions.
Yeah. No, I think that's very well said. So the second thing, the Trump administration is looking for merit-based admissions. Number 2, viewpoint diversity in admissions and hiring. This one, again, seems an obvious thing to me because what we're talking about is not what Harvard wants to do, but if they're going to receive federal dollars. If you are a organization that has a very specific, distinct religious view and you expect all the members to have that, you can't get federal grants. You're not allowed to do so because you don't have a diversity of viewpoints. Same thing should apply to Harvard University. So again, it seems to me a slam dunk. This totally makes sense. If you're going to get federal research dollars, federal support from taxpayers, you need to have diversity in admissions and hiring.
Yeah, I think the thing that Harvard probably is pushing back against the most is the elimination of DEI. I think the antisemitism thing, Harvard would certainly say, I think, like, okay, we can do that.
Right.
They would say they probably have already gone to merit-based admissions, intellectual diversity. That's a survey a lot of universities can send out. That's not hard to do.
Yeah.
But they don't want to be seen as capitulating to the anti-DEI stuff.
Right.
And what's interesting about this is that Harvard's not the only education institution to push back this way. The state of New York has pushed back. I think the state of California has said, no, you can keep your money. But the difference is that New York and California high school systems, public school systems, they get most of their money from state and local taxes, not federal taxes.
Right. So they can afford to say no.
But Harvard has, as many institutions do, as you like to point out, a little bit of a federal money problem.
Yeah. They've got an addiction, and we're going to go into those numbers. So merit-based admissions, viewpoint diversity in admissions. Third one is reforming programs with egregious records of anti-Semitism. Again, Harvard has a history of this. It's now manifested in a different way. And the fourth one, of course, is elimination of DEI, which they are resisting, or they're just renaming programs. Instead of calling them DEI, they call them something else. So Harvard has a problem, and here's where it gets really interesting, because to me, the Trump administration makes 4 great points. I think they're right to tie it. But there's a larger issue here, and that's the fundamental question of should rich institutions, rich individuals, or rich corporations be getting taxpayer money? Harvard has a $53 billion endowment. And, to me, you can't justify the fact that they should be getting so much federal taxpayer dollar, especially when we talk about how that money's actually being spent.
No, it goes into a lot of different ways. And I was shocked to learn just how much money these universities get in federal research dollars.
Yeah.
Johns Hopkins gets $3.3 billion, which is 87% of their research spending. Columbia gets almost $1 billion. Harvard gets $640 million in federal research money.
Right.
And this is part of a larger trend. We started with the Manhattan Project. America wants to have the best research, so we spread a lot of cash around at a lot of different universities.
Right.
And some of it's good, right? I mean, some of the reasons why we continue to be a leader in some innovation is because of the partnership between government and universities. Sure. But it also leads to money being wasted and abused and kind of mischaracterized. And it also, I think, in some sense, creates a sense of entitlement, and these universities feel like they can't be touched.
Oh, 100%. I mean, and that's the thing that's really stunning about this. They talk about they're trying to defend science, right? We want to maintain the integrity of science, but they're not willing to give up these programs or these postures that they have on racial admissions and these other issues because they will not give it up. That's become their religion, and they won't give it up to get this federal taxpayer money. And if that's the case, you say good riddance, go ahead.
Well,
walk away.
And the Trump administration, we talk about how good they are at using leverage.
Yeah.
So of the 25 schools that received the most federal funding in 2023, 16 of them are under investigation for anti-Semitism problems.
Yeah.
So you have to explain to me, like Johns Hopkins got this contract with the Department of Defense to do this research. I don't understand how doing military research involves like being anti-Semitical.
Right.
But so it makes me wonder if it's more just like, hey, this is our entry point to like make sure you guys are doing what we want you to do. We're giving you a ton of money, and you're going to have to comply. And this is the one metric by which, like, you guys are not technically a government institution. I think you said Elon Musk has talked about this. So if they're an NGO and the federal government can't make an NGO comply with what they think the protocol should be, then yank the money until you start doing that. And that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and look, the federal government's done this for decades. The left has done it through the federal government for decades. So, for example, hiring policies, diversity hiring policies, some would even say racial quotas. If you got federal grants, you had to demonstrate that you were engaged in that kind of practice. So this has gone on for decades. What the Trump administration is saying, we're going to turn the tables and we're going to impose some things that we think are important, strings we're going to attach to these federal taxpayer dollars. I think it's important to point out that's very valuable and it's really overdue. The other thing is just how much money we're talking about. American universities spent $60 billion in federal money on research and development in 2023. That's more than 30 times as much was spent in the early 1950s, even adjusted for inflation. So think about the massive growth in taxpayer federal money that has gone for research and development. You mentioned the Manhattan Project where they're building the bomb back in the 1940s. It's gone up astronomically since there, and we're going to get into some of the waste and abuse that has occurred as a result of that.
I was going to say, if you had to take a guess, right? Let's all concede that the Manhattan Project was a worthwhile use of taxpayer money. It's got some national security aspects
Building a bomb,
to it,
baby.
Yeah, and we're trying. Obviously, it won the United States World War II. Do you think that most of the things, and Johns Hopkins obviously doing some work with the Department of Defense, got some national security ramifications, but do you feel like a lot of this skyrocketing increase in federal research is related to things that are benefiting our national security or things that are closer to the leftist cultural takeover that we've seen in academia?
Yeah, I think it's both, right? You do have hard research that's being done, but that's even being infused with these sort of radical ideas. And this is the way that the left funds itself on college campuses. And one of the things that's important to point out is that the way that the federal grants work, the universities want federal grants as opposed to private grants. Number one, because there's more money. But number two, the standards. So if you get a federal grant.
This is a great point.
When you get a federal grant, you can take 30% of the grant. You get $100 million. You can take $30 million and categorize that under quote unquote indirect costs, which means you can essentially put anything. If you want to build a new building, you can take some of the money for federal research on physics and you can actually use it to build a building. It's an indirect cost that you needed for the facility or an improvement or whatever. The interesting thing is when you look at private funders of research like the Bill Gates Foundation, they give out a lot of money on medical research. They only allow 10% to be used for indirect costs. So the point is the federal government system gets abused and the universities use 30% of that money on stuff that's really not even related to the research.
Yeah, and Harvard is perhaps as egregious as it comes when it comes to violations of this, which is another reason why they make an excellent villain / punching bag / foil for what Donald Trump's trying to do.
Yeah. The Harvard Shield, of course, says Veritas truth is what the search in. Harvard has a long history of university spending misconduct. In 2023, this is one of my favorites. There was a researcher, Francesca Gino, who was accused of fraud. The irony being, of course, that she did research on dishonesty.
Okay.
So in 2020, Harvard settled with the federal government over a $1.3 million allegation that a former professor at the School of Public Health overcharged on federal grants. That happens all the time. In 2020, of course, Harvard, Yale, and other schools were accused of failing to report hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign donations they were taking from foreign entities. They're required to, by federal law, disclose if they get more than $250,000. They just ignored that rule. In 2020, of course, that same year, the Ivy League colleges took $220 million in COVID funds. You go back to 2017, after a 6-year investigation, Harvard admitted that they found falsified and fabricated data in 31 papers authored by a researcher that was funded by USAID. In 2012, the Department of Health and Human Services found that a Harvard professor was getting grants in psychology. He engaged in research misconduct. We could go on and on and on and on. The point is, not just is it funding sort of this left-wing behavior, not only are they taking 30% of the money to carve out for other things that have nothing to do with research, some of the research is completely bogus, and these are just the ones that we know of. I'm sure there are others that aren't even discovered. So you have to, wonder. It's not as if the Manhattan Project, where at the end of the day, we either have a bomb or we don't have a bomb. A lot of this research is just kind of airy-fairy social sciences crap that seems to be made up.
First off, I think you should make it a policy to use the phrase airy-fairy in every podcast, and I'm totally serious about it. Secondly, it is interesting. I mean, we are talking about a university whose president was found guilty of plagiarism, and that's ultimately what led to her resignation. So it maybe is not shocking that there's been a decline in overall academic rigor at this university of the president who's making over $1 million a year and lives in this mansion is setting the tone.
So the question is, they have remedial math at Harvard. Do they need remedial ethics?
Well, what they need is some remedial dang logic, because this is why I think Harvard's I think they're messing up. I think they're making a profound miscalculation.
Yeah.
Because while they may lose $2 billion in federal funding, that is not the big thing that we know Harvard is worried about. We've previously done a podcast about how they hired Brian Ballard, not just Brian Ballard's firm, but they hired the ultimate Trump insider lobbyist personally to try to ward off a number of pending attacks by the Trump administration on Harvard. But the most expensive by far is this endowment, right? They have a $53 billion endowment, and that is, that they make it funds itself based on interest. I think it's getting like 8.5%. And you showed me this Barron's article, which I feel richer just reading this Barron's article about the Harvard endowment and how well it's doing.
Right.
But they've had a hard time because philanthropic contributions are down 14% after all the protests with the anti-Semitism stuff. But Trump has said, look, we will go after you.
Right.
And the whole reason right now they only have to pay 1.4% tax on that endowment, which I didn't realize. They only have to do that because of the first Trump administration.
Exactly right.
And so now they're like, look, we will raise this bad boy up. I mean, J.D. Vance proposed when he was in the Senate, I think something like 30%.
Right.
There's been suggestions it could go to 10. The most reasonable number right now seems to take it to 14%. So they're looking at a $400 to $500 million a year tax bill, which is up 10 times what it is right now. It's 40 to 50 million. So if I'm Harvard, and that's the ultimate stick that is looming, not just over you, but other universities, and you know that the Trump administration is balancing their budget and trying to get external revenue in a very serious way, I'd probably be willing to have any conversation the Trump people wanted to have if it's going to help save me $500 million a year.
Yeah, 100%. And by the way, think of how many of these Ivy League faculty members support taxing the rich. Right. And here you've got a Harvard endowment for $53 billion. By the way, when you look at this portfolio, when Harvard talks about their endowment, they say, we're investing in America. We're investing in innovation. Of course, what they don't include is that Harvard owns vineyards in Napa Valley. They own land in Australia, Brazil, and Asia. I mean, the point is they are run like a multinational corporation with their investments. and it's just outrageous that they avoid any tax burden. What essentially is happening is you have a hedge fund, this $53 billion, to which a university has been attached. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what these universities have become. And so the tax policy and the grant policy of giving these federal grants has to reflect that reality.
Two biggest stock holdings, by the way, of this hedge fund to which Harvard is attached.
Yeah.
Google and Facebook.
There
I mean,
you go.
Alphabet and Meta. It's like the two. And meanwhile, the guy's taking victory laps. Like, oh, I'm crushing it. They also own some NVIDIA. Congratulations, guys. But it is funny that, like you own stock and it just goes into it. And that's how Harvard, I mean, an academic critique of capitalism is that it tends toward monopolies.
Right.
And so you have this incredibly well-endowed endowment and they can just have the top stocks and it feeds itself and they're doing very well. But to your point, imagine if you were a company and the company had, let's call it unequitable racial hiring practices.
Right.
And they were super wealthy and their performance had taken a dip and they paid no taxes.
Right.
Most people would have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much where Harvard is.
Yeah, exactly. And look, Harvard with $53 billion, if they're getting roughly 8% a year investment returns, sometimes it's going to be higher, sometimes it's going to be lower. You're looking at basically $4-5 billion a year free cash flow you're getting. You could be using that for research. Mm-hmm. You could have all your students attend Harvard for free. No tuition. You could give your top researchers major salary increases. Instead of doing that, they're building their endowment. Their endowment was $31 billion in 2017. So they are reinvesting that cash. They are growing the endowment, and they're not using it for their stated purpose, which is educating young people and doing research. And they're expecting taxpayers to subsidize as they build this endowment.
They are the biggest cow on the field, and the Trump folks are looking to bring something into the slaughterhouse. And I'm just saying, if I was Harvard, I'd be very, very careful. And it seems like a miscalculation because this is how big Harvard is. There's 658 institutions that the National Association of Colleges and Universities business officers kind of put together. Yeah. 658 universities. The collective endowment of these 658 is $873 billion.
Wow.
So, like, Harvard's like 7% of that.
Yeah.
I mean, so...
Yeah. They're the big boy. They are the big boy. And I think in any competition between the Trump administration and Harvard for where the public's going to be, Harvard is seriously overestimating their brand and the appeal to the American people.
And their president knew it, right? I mean, they figured that out post October 7th, and they realized, oh, man, we have massively misplayed this. That's why they hired all these lobbyists for the first time in a long time. They had their lobbying expenditures have been down. So it's just interesting. They went out, they hired these Trump insiders, and it seemed like they were trying to play nice, and now all of a sudden... either that they're getting bad advice or they're not listening or whatever has happened, but it seems to be a departure from where we thought they were going to go.
Yeah. Well, as we always say on this podcast, whether it comes to corporations or NGOs, we believe in the free market. We don't believe in crony capitalism. There's a difference. Crony capitalism relies on connections, relies on government largesse, and that is what these major universities have become. So your thoughts, how this is going to play out ultimately?
Yeah, I think they'll do it. I think they will absolutely throw a tax.
The Trump administration will
throw a tax on. They will raise taxes. They've already done it once. Like, why would you think they wouldn't do it again? And so they've demonstrated a capacity to do it. They've demonstrated that collecting revenue to balance our national debt is a real deal for them. And to the extent that the math is like Trump likes to get on the 80 side of these 80-20 issues, and you present it, does this woke, anti-Semitic, anti-white, poor-performing, allegedly elite university has sitting on all that cash, we're giving them more, they're paying no taxes, you and everybody else has to pay taxes, why would we let these guys get away with it for free?
Yeah.
That's their argument, and it's, I think, going to be reasonably compelling to a majority of Americans.
No, I think you're right on that. I think you're absolutely right. We're going to watch this story as we watch all examples of cronyism, corruption. We do appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. We know your time is valuable. You can find out more about the research we do at thedrilldown.com. And of course, you can subscribe to this podcast. Please do, wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.